it is time to start learning about how to tidy data. So I'm going to introduce you to some functions that will help us get data into a tidy format. So I have some data called sprint data that are in a wide format. Let's read that in and let's take a look at it. So here we have the times for 7 sprinters. And these are times when they ran an obstacle course. And they ran this course 6 different times. So here is sprinter 1 across 6 different trials. Now, according to the rules of tidy data, we need to put this in long format. This is typically the format you'll see your data in with repeated measures. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not considered tidy. And there have been uses for having it in this wide format. I'm going to show you that. And I'm also going to show you why that usefulness kind of disappears once you start using pipes and other tools in the tidyverse. So the gather function will allow us to gather the columns into new variables. We need to know the set of the columns, the name of the variable that is currently in column headings, and the name of the values. So if you look at this, trials is really a variable. In other words, we can say, well, we have person 1, but we have them on a trial, and then we have a time for them. Okay? And so we could put trial as a variable, and then we could have the time as another variable. So this way of having the data set up is tidy if you consider each different trial a separate variable. But it would also be tidy if instead we looked at trial as a variable itself rather than each separate trial. So let me show you what I mean. So we're going to take this and we're going to take the sprint data. I'm going to pipe the sprint data, which is what you're looking at right here, into this function called gather. And this function is going to take trial 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, gather it so that we have the key trial, and then it's going to use time for the values that are in our cells. So these trials up here are now going to be converted into trial with the separate numbers of the trials, and then time will be in the cell. And I don't want to just print it on the screen. I want to save it. So let's do this. Now let's see what we have. Look at this. You now have trial 1 under the trial variable. 7.76 is the time, and so forth, with 32 more rows. Let me go ahead and look at the whole thing here. Here you go. So now what we're looking is the ID, trial as a variable, time as a variable. What do we call this? We call this the long format. If you've worked with repeated measures before where you've had to switch back and forth from wide to long and vice versa, you probably remember that you had to do things like go into Excel and either do a lot of typing by hand or figure out formulas and so forth. Those days are over, my friend. We now can get from the wide format of sprint, which we saw here, to the long format of tidy sprint, like I see here, in just one series of piped commands using the gather function. The spread function is the opposite. So it will help us go the other way. So traditional analysts state that this is repeated measures. And suppose what I want to do is keep every trial as a separate variable, which is what I would do if I was doing multivariate analysis. So quick review, because it might have been a long time since you did this. When you have repeated measures data, you have two choices for analysis. One method is to do univariate analysis. And when we do univariate analysis, we need that data in this long format, because what you're doing is you're creating one variable. That's the term univariate. You're creating one variable, time, and then you're going to have ID and trial as your factors in your model. You're going to be removing the variation due to ID, that is the different individuals, and you're going to see how much variation is left, and that's the effect of interest, which is trial. If you're doing this in a multivariate sense, then you want it in this format, because in multivariate, this would be considering every trial its own variable. So in a multivariate sense, this would be tidy, but in a univariate sense, this would be tidy. Okay? If you go back and do this multivariate, so if you've never had in class in multivariate, what researchers will do is consider each of these a variable, and then we'll analyze this keeping each of those a variable. So what if you had the data in this format, long, and you needed to put it in this? So pretend we didn't have this right now. Okay, this was the original way I had it in my spreadsheet. But imagine if this was the original way I had it in my spreadsheet. Then we'll use the opposite of the gather function, which is the spread function. So I'm going to create yet another object with my data in it that I'm going to call sprint wide. So I'm going to take the long format, tidy sprint, I'm going to pipe it to spread. I'm going to tell it that the key is trial. That is, I want trial to now be separated out into separate variables, and I want time to be the value. And so this will put it now in tidy format for multivariate use. So here we go, and let's look at it. Let's look at the tibble we just created. There it is. So we've taken from long format to wide format. So any of you who have cursed your way through trying to use Excel to change these formats, now you can say, why didn't I know this way back then? Because it makes it so much easier to be able to go back and forth between formats. So we are starting to look at functions for tidying data, and we've now seen the gather function will gather columns into a new variable, and the spread function will separate a single column into multiple columns. So once again, to remind you, the wide format is not tidy if you're doing univariate analysis. That would be the long format, but it is tidy if you're doing multivariate analysis. And again, I am taking these long and wide formats and relating to them to the rules that we learned about what makes tidy data.